Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Medical Toxicology podcast series for Ukraine. This is the first module on nuclear power plant related injuries. My name is Ziad Kazi, and I'm a professor and director of the International Medical Toxicology Fellowship at Emory University. I'm an emergency physician and a medical toxicologist here in the US, but I'm active in the area of emergency preparedness to radiation injuries and chemical injuries in the Middle East, as well as in the US. And I had an experience with responding in the US to the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. And I wanted to share with you today what I've learned over the last 17 years in this area that can help you think through the potential hazards of nuclear power plants if they're affected through the war in Ukraine. This podcast series is brought to you by a number of nonprofit organizations, including Minatox, ACNT, GRM, and IDMC. All of these organizations are here to help alleviate the suffering and help educate our colleagues in Ukraine, as well as in neighboring countries like Poland and Georgia, about the potential hazards from the war. And this specific module is going to focus on the potential hazards that can be created if a nuclear power plant is affected through the war. You will also be able to discuss the management and assessment of people that are potentially concerned that they were affected by the radiation emitted in case of a nuclear power plant release. The first thing you want to think about, and the first thing I want to talk to you about, is the way these nuclear power plants function. Remember, nuclear power plants create or generate electricity. They do that by converting steam to electrical power. The steam is created through the nuclear reactor fission reaction. This is where you have basically a nuclear reactor core that contains fissile material like uranium that is undergoing a chain reaction. Chain reaction, fission reaction, releasing tremendous amount of heat that is generated into steam, that is cooled down and generates steam. This steam, in turn, is going to create electricity. The nuclear fission reaction that's ongoing inside the reactor vessel is going to generate neutrons, other radioactive materials like iodine, cesium, and strontium, and heat. To control this reaction, you have to continuously provide a coolant that is pumped into the reactor using electricity. So you need an electrical source to keep pumping the coolant into the reactor to maintain everything in a controlled fashion. If you lose if you lose the pumps that are pumping the coolant, if you lose the coolant, if you lose electricity that runs the pumps, then you can get into a problem like we saw in the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. We also saw a similar problem with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident of 1986. When this happens, the coolant is lost, and then the reaction can go out of control. This can generate explosions, fires, as we saw in Chernobyl, as well as we saw in Fukushima. This heat is going to convert some of this radioactive material, like iodine, into a gaseous form that can be emitted from the reactor, especially if the containment structure around the reactor is destroyed or damaged by the explosion. The material released can then spread into the environment. We'll talk about the hazards from that in the next few slides. Now remember that the nuclear power plant also will store radioactive material that has already been through the fission reaction. We call that spent fuel. This radioactive waste material or spent fuel is often also stored on the site of the nuclear power plant and also requires a coolant to keep it from releasing radioactive emissions outside the containment structure. The good news is that in Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant is no longer active. However, you do have the remaining material from the accident of 1986 that is currently contained in a containment structure And also, my understanding is that it also requires coolant. The good news is that the material at this point, since 1986 till now, is less radioactive. For example, iodine, which is one of the main public health hazards after a nuclear power plant emergency, is not there anymore because it already decayed into a stable form. So the material that are still in the spent fuel storage sites in Chernobyl are probably going to be cesium or strontium or other long-living radioactive nuclei. And they are surrounded by a solid structure, protecting them from potential explosions or shells. The coolant itself can be a problem if you stop providing it. But that, again, requires proper infrastructure, such as electricity, and proper maintenance and monitoring by the operators. This is not the case for, same case for other nuclear power plants that are active in Ukraine. Those have still the fission reaction that's ongoing. They'll still have radioactive iodine in there, and potentially, if it's released, can cause public health issues in the surrounding area. The way this iodine can be released is by a malfunction, loss of infrastructure, like loss of electricity, malfunction of the pumps, of the generators, loss of the operators to be able to work on the nuclear power plant. All of these are potential issues. Another potential issue is physical damage to the containment structure and the reactor itself. Usually these reactors are built in solid structures with steel or concrete that resist bombs, but again, it depends on the type of containment you have and the size of the bomb that you are, the bomb that is in question in this scenario. So there's always potentially a risk of penetrating the containment structure, causing a fire, and releasing the material. We saw in Chernobyl, there was an important fire with the graphite type reactor that was difficult to extinguish. And that really caused the radioactive material to evaporate and disperse in the environment around Chernobyl and European countries. Once this material is dispersed, you have a couple of types of hazards that you have to think about. The first one is really affecting the immediate area around the nuclear power plant release. We usually use in the United States a 16-kilometer radius around the nuclear power plant. This radioactive cloud, composed of radioactive material that were inside the reactor, that are now released because the reactor lost its containment, is going to potentially emit gamma rays. They are like X-rays. And this radioactive cloud that's passing in the environment, these gamma rays that are emitted can expose people in that environment, especially if they're outside and not sheltered inside a home. This external exposure to radiation can lead to acute radiation injuries, but they're not very likely because you have to have significant exposure duration. You have to be exposed to sufficient dose of radiation from these gamma rays to get the acute radiation syndrome. So these are less likely, but not impossible, especially if you're very close to the nuclear reactor. For example, if you're a firefighter or if you're an operator trying to fix the nuclear power plant, if you're a paramedic trying to rescue people inside the nuclear power plant area, then you can potentially get these high doses of gamma rays that can lead to the acute radiation syndrome. Typically, the people that are in the surrounding area have enough time to evacuate or shelter in place in a nuclear power plant accident because they usually have some sort of signals, alarms that something is going wrong. Now, in a war, it may be different. It may be sudden, and they may have less time to evacuate or shelter. But that said, the further away you are from the plant, the less likely you are to get these acute illnesses. People around the nuclear power plant can also potentially inhale some of the radioactive material that is in a gaseous form, like iodine. Now, that can go to the thyroid gland and increase the risk of thyroid disease and cancer. We'll talk about that in a little bit more details. The greater problem that can occur with nuclear power plant releases is more, the contamination of the environment. Once you contaminate the environment, you can contaminate food sources like milk, which is going to be, a problem, especially for children that consume a lot of milk. It may contain bodies of water like rivers or the ocean that may end up showing up in your seafood or fish. It can also contaminate vegetables, especially leafy vegetables that can actually get the deposition of radioactive material on them. Because remember, this radioactive material is spreading in the environment may deposit again for a variety of reasons, depending on the weather patterns. It can end up in your vegetables and contaminate your food sources. Also, the radioactive material on the ground that has deposited, can be emitting gamma rays that are creating radiation levels that need people to evacuate the area, because if they stay there for a long time, they have a higher risk of cancer. But remember, these are all long-term health effects, nothing acute from these contamination levels, around the nuclear power plant, especially outside the 16-kilometer radius. Think about Chernobyl's exclusion areas where people could not live. Think about exclusion areas around the Fukushima nuclear power plant. People that were evacuated from these areas, not because they were going to get acutely sick, but primarily because of their long-term increased risk of cancer from living in this area with higher radiation levels because of the deposition of the contamination. In Chernobyl, the primary issue was, again, milk, and this is why the primary affected population was children and those who were in utero during the incident. In Fukushima, on the other hand, because there was evacuation and sheltering, we believe there's much less risk of the increase in thyroid cancer. In Chernobyl, as you know, there was a failure of some of these protective measures, like protecting people from the food, like the milk. And that's why you did have an increased risk of thyroid cancer. And I think the international bodies have actually associated about 6,000 thyroid cancer cases to the Chernobyl accident exposure. And this can be outside Ukraine as well, because this subject material can spread, as you saw in Chernobyl, and can affect neighboring countries. Of course, you see here the leopard skin pattern because it's heterogeneous deposition because of the weather patterns and the rain patterns. And typically, though, the further away you are, the less radioactive contamination you can get. But again, I want to reinforce that people that are really close to the nuclear power plant, like firefighters, nuclear power plant workers, people that are really close, paramedics, they may get these acute high-dose exposures from the radioactive cloud emissions of gamma rays. And they can lead to acute injuries. We saw in Chernobyl, 137 emergency workers had acute radiation syndrome, and 28 of them died within the first few months after the disaster. This is why it's important to learn how to shelter in place if there's a radioactive cloud passing in your community. Staying inside, closing your windows and ventilation. Provide yourself with shielding from this radiation by selecting a room that is the most inner room of your structure. If you're in a building, the basement is better than the ground floor. The ground floor is better than the second floor. Also try to stay away from the roof because you'll have deposition potentially of the radioactive material on the roof, exposing your top floor. So a lower floor is better in that case. So I would recommend going inside, staying inside, and staying tuned for further instructions about what to do. Solid structure like concrete is better than a wooden structure, and a wooden structure is better than a car, and a car is probably better than being completely outside. Now, when you are thinking about patients that can come to your hospital, let's say evacuating from a nuclear power plant affected area, you want to think about your safety. And what's recommended for you is just your typical standard precautions with your gloves, gowns, face mask, a surgical mask is sufficient. You don't have an N95, both are sufficient in these cases, because remember, the victims are potentially contaminated with radioactive material on their body or inside of their body. And the risk of you getting some of that material inside your body is limited, especially if you put a mask on, wear gloves, don't eat or smoke, or without in an area where you're potentially contaminated. And of course, check these people for contamination. And if they're contaminated, you can perform your decontamination. You can remove their clothes. You can look for the areas that are contaminated and wash them with water or soap and water. And of course, always apply the three important protective principles: time, distance, and shielding. So limit your time spent near a person that's contaminated. the less time you spend, the less radiation exposure you get, because your radiation exposure dose depends on the time you spend near that source of radiation emission. Maximize your distance from that source. Remember, if you double your distance from the source, you decrease your exposure dose by 4. Remember, the radiation dose you receive is inversely proportional to the square of distance. And of course, lastly, shielding. If you have radioactive material, radioactively contaminated clothing or supplies, put them away from where you are sitting and put them behind the wall and put a sign that says radioactive material is stored in this area. Unfortunately, the lead aprons that we use in the hospital for x-rays are not efficient for gamma rays and therefore are not going to protect you. So again, your level D with your surgical mask, goggles, gloves, and gown are sufficient, especially when you add to it protective measures like limiting your time, increasing your distance, and shielding yourself from the radioactive material. We have a lot of experience from this, that people that took care of victims that are contaminated with radioactive material, doctors and nurses did not get sick. Think about Chernobyl, think about Goiânia, Brazil, think about Mr. Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium in London. All of these scenarios had healthcare providers providing care to victims, and the healthcare providers did not receive any significant doses that led them to develop acute illness or an increased long-term illness. If someone is contaminated, you will know it because you will do a radiation survey. Contamination with radioactive material is easy to detect in general with a Geiger-Müller counter that you see here on top, or a digital form of that below. We also have these portal monitors where you can pass people rapidly, a large number of people per hour, to screen them for contamination with radioactive material. Of course, this is really effective when the radioactive material emits gamma rays that are detectable easily with these type of devices. And luckily for us, most of the radioactive material that we are worried about, and those that are released from a nuclear power plant accident like iodine and cesium, they emit gamma rays. And gamma rays are detectable by these devices. You have to be thorough in your survey if you have time by surveying the entire body. If you don't have time, you may decide to do more abbreviated checks of important areas like the head, shoulders, hands, face, and then keep going that way, because then you can spend less time per patient. The issue that you think about here is the health effects of this contamination with radioactive material. Contamination with radioactive material after a nuclear power plant accident is primarily concerning because of the iodine. And the radioactive iodine can be internalized into the body by inhalation or by ingestion to the milk, for example. And it goes to the thyroid gland, increases your risk of thyroid cancer and thyroid diseases, unless you have saturated your thyroid gland with potassium iodide. It's important to remember that potassium iodide, however, to be effective, has to be used either before you are contaminated with radioactive material or within 4 hours after the contamination. This is why it's difficult to really use it sometimes if you don't have it already in the hands of the public. But it's also important to remember that potassium iodide is only useful to protect you from thyroid disease from radioactive iodine. Potassium iodide is not useful to protect you from cesium. It's not useful to protect you from the cloud of radiation passing by, emitting you to gamma rays. So it's not a magical pill that protects you from all radiation hazards. It's limited to radioactive iodine and the thyroid gland. And therefore, its application sometimes is limited, and sometimes there's no reason to use it. Like in Fukushima, for example, there was no public health recommended administration of potassium iodide. So that's something to remember. I think people now are buying potassium iodide. They need to remember that the use of potassium iodide should be following proper public health guidance in these specific people that are at risk of becoming contaminated with radioactive iodine. Other more important steps are sheltering in place, evacuation, protecting them from food that's contaminated, milk that's contaminated, and water that can potentially be contaminated. Those are more important protective actions than potassium iodide per se. Going back to the emergency department, as you are wearing your level D PPE and you are assessing these victims, remember one important thing. These are not, the contamination with radioactive material is not in itself a major emergency. If somebody comes in with a traumatic injury to their brain, to their chest, or they need to be intubated for respiratory protection, those should be done before you worry about performing, a radiation survey and doing proper decontamination with soap and water. All of that is secondary to the life-saving interventions. Now, if somebody comes in a stable fashion, then sure, you can do a radiation survey. Of course, you can remove their clothing. You can do a survey again, find what area is contaminated, wash it with soap and water, and then repeat the survey to see if the radiation contamination has decreased. And again, this is in a nuclear power plant accident, not as important as in other type of scenarios involving radiation. So I hope that really alleviates some of your concerns with potential nuclear power plant injuries from the war in Ukraine. Remember again, this potassium iodide has limited role. It's only for the thyroid, and it's only for radioactive iodine. It's not useful for other types of radioactive material or exposure to radiation from an external source. That said, in Chernobyl accident, 6,000 people developed cancer associated with their exposure in that nuclear power plant accident. But remember, in that case, because there were no protective action measures that were properly placed, children were still drinking the milk that was contaminated with radioactive material. That's important to remember as you deal with all these unknowns that you're going through right now in Ukraine and in surrounding countries. So I hope you found this material useful. We'll provide additional modules that will tackle the nuclear detonation scenario. We'll also provide some materials on how to perform a radiation survey. We'll provide some videos for that that are made available by the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So stay tuned, be safe, and just want to share with you that we are all concerned, and our thoughts are always with you in your struggle and fight. Feel free to follow me at Ziad Kazi, or to follow ACMT or MENA Talks, and email me at zkazi@emory.edu.